move on to this. I just wanted to move on to this, particularly cities, because cities have been one of the neglected entities in history, and without understanding how cities organize space and the different kinds of spaces they organize, it is very hard to understand many aspects of history. So let's begin just by saying that we are maintaining the same idea, the same model. It's a part-to-whole relationship. Many neighborhoods, some of them residential neighborhoods, some of them government districts, some of them industrial districts, some of them recreational neighborhoods, together as component parts compose a city. Several cities together, and I'm going to analyze this in detail in a second, compose what is called urban regions. Several urban regions together compose what is called a province, or in the United States, a province in Europe. In the United States, these are called just states. Now, this is not the same thing as the state, right? It's just states. And finally, several provinces stitched together, typically via warfare, this is one point that I will make later on, end up constructing larger territorial entities like kingdoms, empires, nation-states. There's a variety of large entities. But I would argue that to go past that level of scale, warfare has always been needed. Even in the case where several provinces come together amicably, like the 13 original colonies that made up the United States, right? They came together amicably and formed a union after the War of Independence against England. The moment some of the states began to defer over a very sensitive issue and a very important economic issue like slavery, they threatened to secede. Now, secession is a process that occurs to these kinds of entities. Is the partition of a territory and the dismemberment of what used to be a union, what used to be a single country, into two countries. And how did the United States prevent that dismemberment from occurring? How did it keep those rebel provinces in line? Through warfare, right? That was the Civil War in the United States. Now, other counterexamples. Well, how about the European Union? The European Union came together amicably, right? France and Germany first created the European Common Market, and they began to join other countries. Now they have a single currency, and now they are aiming at political union. Yes, but this is only after 400 years in which France and Germany began wars that exhausted Europe, and that in fact almost killed Europe. Because Europe at the beginning of the 20th century was the leading area of the world in all respects, science, economics, military power. But if you fight two world wars in your own territory, started as typically by France and Germany, you're going to lose that first place. Europe emerged from World War I as a debtor nation. They owed money to Japan and the United States. By the time they emerged from World War II, their status had come down tremendously. Of course, they have managed to bring it back up. But if they came together amicably to form some larger continental union, it was after exhaustion from warfare. Now, I'm not going to insist on that point because I would need an entire class to prove it to you, right? But if in the question and answer period this comes up, I will be happy to elaborate. Let's then just focus on this area here. To finish, at least not to finish the class, but to finish this part of the class. Cities and towns which interact with one another, and from their interactions, an urban region emerges. Right? So it would be an assemblage, just like we've been saying all along. Well, here's one way in which things happen in Europe. This diagram down here is valid only for Europe. This diagram was created by a geographer in the 1930s. His name is Christaller. Christaller was poring over maps of Europe and began to realize that the roads that connect different towns together had a very peculiar quality. There would be roads from the largest town in a particular region to the medium-sized towns, and then there would be roads from the medium-sized towns to the small-sized towns, and then there would be roads from the small-sized towns to the tiny little towns, but there would not be roads from the small towns to the large town, and even less so from the teeny-weeny little towns from the main town. So that if you wanted to go from here to here, you had to go up the hierarchy. So he called this a central place hierarchy. And there's still a model that's used in geography to study urban regions. It's called a central place hierarchy, this being the central place. So what else did Christaller tell us? This is, by the way, this is the region that it forms. If you want to think of something concrete, think of this region as perhaps the Ile-de-France with Paris as its regional capital. Or think of it as Burgundy with Lyon as its regional capital. Even in the United States, this is true. Every state has several regional capitals. Pennsylvania has, of course, the region around Philadelphia, but also the region around Pittsburgh. New York has the region around Manhattan, but also the region around Buffalo, and also the region around Albany. You cannot find a state that doesn't have several regional capitals. The patterns of roads in the United States are different because the United States grew into a country when the railroad already existed. And as we will see if I have time, the railroad completely changed things because it is transportation limitations that create these patterns. Now, Christaller had several more ideas to tell us about what emerges at the level of the full region. He said, first of all, in addition to the fact that the towns are of different sizes, large, medium, small, tiny, the number of services, medical services, educational services, ecclesiastical services like baptisms and weddings, government services like courts and jails and police stations and so on, become more differentiated the larger the size of the city. So, in the teeny-weeny little towns over here, the only service that is available is a bazaar, a marketplace. In Europe, as in many other parts of the world, even the tiniest towns have a bazaar. Right? Bazaars and urbanity have gone together for as long as we have records of urban centers. Right? So, back then, of course, the countryside, each city had a certain amount of countryside around it. So the tiny little towns offered a single service, the bazaar to the peasants and farmers in its countryside. Right? They say there is a bazaar that meets on Saturdays. Well, every Saturday, the peasants and farmers will come to the city to sell their stuff and to buy perhaps some of the manufactured products that are created in the city. Tiny little towns, there's probably very simple products like belts and belt buckles and shoelaces and things like that, and perhaps some farming instruments. Right? When you go to the next level, you may already find, in addition to a bazaar, which now might be a little larger and with a little more variety of vegetables and fruits and meats and so on, you already find perhaps a county jail and perhaps a church offering mass as a service. Right? So the people from a teeny weeny little towns have to go to church by foot every Sunday and then go back to the teeny-weeny little towns. So Christaller said the distances between towns should correlate with the mode of transportation. If this is a phenomenon that began in the 14th and 15th centuries. Back then, the fastest mode of terrestrial transportation was horses, and in particular something that we might call anachronistically a pony express. This is more like mounted courier. That would be a better term, right? The fastest form of terrestrial transportation was to have somebody delivering information, typically important information about politics, about war, about high finance, in a horse, but having several stations with fresh horses. So the moment this guy gets here, it changes horses and continues. Gets here, changes horses and continues. So that was the fastest way in which information or people could travel in the 14th and 15th centuries. Most people walk by foot. So the distances between these towns needed to be, you needed to be able to do them in a quarter of a day, half a day maximum, right? Because if you're going to go Mass every Sunday, you're not going to spend the whole day walking to the next town. Right? So he began measuring the distances, and the distances were appropriate to that. Right? So then he was on the medium-sized towns, added now larger jails, may add a courthouse, may even have a royal court, not with a king and the queen, but with some prominent aristocrats already housed in that medium-sized town. It might already have some medical facilities. It may have some, wholesalers that offer other types of commercial services. You might have a few small industries that also offer some services. And finally, the regional capital has the largest number of services in the entire region. Right? Has several marketplaces. Perhaps some of them are already permanent. That is, instead of being weekly or bi-weekly, as they are in most of the other towns. It has, of course, is the seat of the regional government. So certain government problems that you need to fix, like a birth certificate or something like that, you need to go all the way to the central town to get that. And that was a regularity that Gilles Deleuze found. The multiplicity of services increases with the size of the town in a central place hierarchy. That other geographers have now verified that, and that turns out to be roughly right. So now let's start talking about emergent properties. Well, for one thing, say in the 11th century, the prices at which things went in a marketplace over here and in a marketplace over here and a marketplace over here were relatively different. Not necessarily completely different, but they did not go up and down at unison. Right? Demand and supply did not affect prices in every single town of a region in the 11th century identically. But as Fernand Braudel reminds us, by the 14th century, prices go up and down in synchrony throughout an entire region. This again is only valid for Europe and for the century that I'm talking about, right? So, once prices begin going up and down at the same time in the entire region, well then those prices are an emergent property of the entire region. What causes prices to become synchronous throughout a region? Well, it is the volume and intensity and regularity of trade between cities. Below a certain volume of trade, that is when only a few things get trade, and when the trade is not regular, is haphazard, is kind of, sometimes we trade this amount, some other times we trade another amount, prices cannot go up and down in synchrony throughout. But once trade between cities becomes regular enough, you can count on the fact that shipments from that city will come on a Friday, they come on a Saturday. And once the volume of trade is high enough, in terms of tons of grain, in terms of heads of cattle, in terms of amounts of manufactured goods, simple manufactured goods like dresses and shoes, then volume and regularity of trade cause prices to now go up and down throughout the entire region. And those regional prices, which by the way are always, at least the ones historians consider are average prices for wholesale commodities, like metals like iron and copper, and grains like wheat and corn and barley. Once those prices begin going up and down throughout the region has acquired that as an emergent property. Now let me give you another example from Gilles Deleuze. Cultural aspects of a particular region. Everybody that's been to France knows that the Ile-de-France has a slightly different culture than Burgundy. And Lyon and Paris have been long life enemies and rivals, right? And the French of Paris turned out to become the dominant form of French in France. But the people from Lyon wanted their French to be the dominant language in the land. Right? So several regions with different regional capitals. Now, Gilles Deleuze began to remember what I just said about culture. Culture is a kind of memory that each one of these entities has. The memory of communities, the memory of organizations, the memory of persons, the memory of cities in the form of museums, collections. Once this region forms and the roads are in place, cultural producers, say painters, poets, cooks, tailors, pottery makers, metallurgists or blacksmiths, carpenters, anybody who produces some or another form of craft or cultural product of any form, begin to migrate in specific patterns in the region. Those who happen to have been born in the teeny-weeny little towns eventually get bored with the teeny little, particularly if they are artists, and move to the next size town, to a small town, where they meet perhaps 3 or other more painters that they like. Then the 3 of them say, hey, look, we're going to need more excitement. We're going to need something more. So they move together to the medium-sized towns. And after a while, their migratory pattern ends up in the regional capital. And cultural producers from throughout the region now have migrated, following this hierarchical set of roads, to the regional capital. After 200 years or so, those cultural producers, because they come from different parts of the region, they brought perhaps slight different variations in the way you make certain sauces, slight different variations in the way in which you sew dresses, or in which you finish them, little details, but that were unknown because they were far apart. Now that those cultural producers have gathered in the regional capital, that can start being distilled or synthesized into a regional culture that can then be re-exported to the rest of the region. And via that process, this is Cristallaire's theory, regions acquire their own cultural identity in terms of their cuisine, in terms of in the dressing styles, and even in the fine arts like painting, music, and poetry, and other forms of cultural products. Of course, that doesn't mean that they have to recreate every single aspect of their memory that way, because cities have memories, and organizations within cities have memories, and communities within cities have memories. Some of those memories may be very long. For instance, it doesn't matter that Paris and Lyon were rivals and they tried to develop different regional cultures. They were both Christian. In other words, ecclesiastical organizations inhabiting, churches and cathedrals and so on, inhabiting different cities, had now a memory, a cultural memory, a cultural tradition that goes back, in the case of Christianity, 2,000 years, in the case of Judaism, 6,000 years, and so on and so forth. So it's not as if every single aspect of a regional culture had to be synthesized. It's only the aspects that make that region unique, the aspects that differentiate it from other regions. But it might share memories via its organizations and communities and so on with other regions. For instance, it might share a religion, right? Or it might share a love for wine, or it might share many other things that are shared by different regions. But the little details, that little spice that gives that soup a special flavor, and you cannot find it in other regions, that special touch in the way finishing dresses, that people come here to buy those dresses because you cannot find them elsewhere, are synthesized by the migratory patterns of cultural producers as organized by the distribution of cities in a region. That is Cristallaire's theory of urban regions. It has withstood the test of time to a certain extent. It was postulated in the 1930s first. To this day, Fernand Braudel and a bunch of other historians of cities use Cristallaire's theories. The only problem with his theories is that they are only applied to Europe. And they only apply to Europe before the 19th century. Because the reason why these patterns form was because of the slowness of terrestrial transport. Since, as I said, the fastest form of transportation was mounted courier or a pony express, and not that many people could afford that, then transportation by foot, by walking, was the norm, and that slowness of transportation is one of the reasons why those patterns emerged.
Could you write down Cristallaire or spell it out?
Yeah. Let's write it right here. to take it with a grain of salt, remember guys. As we have to take everything with a grain of salt, because what we are what we're in the business here is detecting variation, detecting heterogeneity, right? We don't want to say this is the essence of the region or something like that. That would kill the entire analysis, right? This is one diagram for this particular area here. We can multiply diagrams. Let me in fact show you another diagram, also for Europe, also for the same time, which shows you that several systems of cities coexist. I'm going to have to draw a map of Europe because I cannot draw very well. I'm going to do it in a cubist style. That's Europe. That's Italy. That's England. Ta-da! If you want to put Scandinavia, Sweden, Norwegia, and so on up there, you want to put Africa down here, the Levant, and so on, fine. You want to continue it over there towards more of an Eastern Europe, sure. Be my guest. This is the best I'm going to be able to do, guys. Okay, in the same centuries, in the same millennium, remember that the 11th century, the year 1000, is when Europe is born. And it was obviously before the Roman Empire, and there was the Greeks and so on, but they were not Europe. Europe as a continent really is born, roughly, in the 10th and 11th centuries. So, but moving on to the century that we were talking about before, like 14 centuries or something, there were already completely different systems of cities. This is Venice. This is Genoa. This is Lisbon. This is Antwerp in today's Belgium, or what used to be called Flanders. This is Amsterdam. These are the several cities that belong to the Hanseatic League. I'm not even going to put the names. Hamburg, and so on. The Hansa, a bunch of city-states speaking German. And this is London, which is a weird example because it's half capital, half maritime metropolis. All of the cities were maritime metropolises. They were ports. They were connected to the sea. And the sea, back then and even today, rather than separating, like land distances do, connects. Seas, whether the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Pacific, whether seas or oceans, actually act as connective tissue between cities. If you have the technology to do that connection, that is, if you have ships, vessels, different types of sea vessels and other forms of sea transportation. By the 14th century, these cities not only already existed, they were interconnected with one another in a completely different way than the connections that we just showed. Venice was connected to Genoa, to Lisbon, to London, to Antwerp, to Amsterdam, to the Hansa League, but Genoa was directly connected to London. London was directly connected to the Hanseatic League. London, in fact, was directly connected to Venice. And I'm not going to keep adding those lines because it's going to become a mess, but you get my point. It is not the same system of connections. It has a different topology. The other one was hierarchical. You go from the teeny-weeny little towns to the small towns, to the medium-sized town, to the large towns. Here, everything is connected to everything else. And by the 14th century, they had already become a tight enough network that it was that network of ships that propagated the black rats with their fleas that carried the Black Plague. Had this network, the Black Plague arrived, bubonic plague arrived in Europe from China. Today, even today, the largest locus of Black Plague, of black rats carrying bubonic plague is at the foothills of the Himalayas. Even today, kind of rodent cities at the foothills of the Himalayas. They used the Silk Road, which of course is an ancient route passing through different caravanserais. which joined China to Islam, or to the Ottoman Empire, or the different empires, the different Islamic empires that lived in these areas here. And through Islam, it was connected to Europe. Europeans bought porcelains and silks and other fancy stuff from the Chinese. And so the Silk Road was a road that was continuously traveled. Well, black rats hitched a ride in those caravans and killed some people along the way, but apparently not enough, were able to survive until they reached Venice. Now, had this network not existed, had not all the cities been completely interconnected together, the rats would not have been able to propagate through Europe as fast as they did. The plague arrived in Europe in the 1340s. And it did not go away until the 1600s. But they hitched a ride. They first hitched a ride on the caravans, and then they hitched a ride on ships and boats that linked the entire continent together already by the 14th century. Now, this network has a very, very different characteristics from the one that we just saw. For one thing, each one of the cities organizes a region in its own backyard, but in a very different way than the others. Whereas in a region like the Ile-de-France, with Paris as its capital, a relatively homogeneous culture was distilled, what we still recognize today as Parisian culture. Here, none of those cities developed a culture of its own. They were happy being hybrids. Right? If you, for instance, look at Gothic architecture in Paris, like Notre Dame, and compare it with equivalent Gothic architecture in Venice, you're not going to see any relationship whatsoever. Gothic architecture in Venice looks Islamic. They have influence from Islam. And there's a very good reason for that. These were trading cities. Well, the other ones were trading cities too, but they traded with each other. These cities engaged in long-distance trade, which was way more profitable. Because unlike the other cities, which connect towns, which eventually all of them will have prices going up and down together, and therefore you cannot take advantage of dislocations between demand and supply, these guys used to trade with cities as far as, in India or in the Levant, and so on. In other words, they were connected markets, the demand and supply of which did not relate to one another. So they could go and trade a few things for very valuable spices, for instance, cinnamon or pepper, and then sell the cinnamon or pepper at whatever price they could get away with, because there was no mechanism to make the prices of spices reflect demand and supply. So these cities were in the business of manipulating demand and supply from the beginning. This is why Fernand Braudel says that this network of cities in the 14th century was the birthplace of capitalism. And this is the place where I break with Deleuze and Guattari. Deleuze and Guattari have read Braudel, and they disagree with Braudel. They say capitalism could not have been born in the 14th century with this network of cities. Capitalism needed a larger territorial state like, France, or a larger territorial state like, with a landlocked capital in order to flourish. Now, I disagree with that, and I disagree with that because if we're going to be talking about historical data and we're going to be comparing Deleuze and Guattari with Braudel, well, Deleuze and Guattari are going to lose. Braudel is the master of this theme, and it's not just Braudel. It was Braudel and an army of researchers belonging to the school of the Annales. Right? Fernand Braudel, I must have mentioned this already, is the most important economic historian of the 20th century. If there was a Nobel Prize for history, which there isn't, he would get that Nobel Prize today, posthumously, after his death, because he's already dead. But he would get it, because no one comes even close to matching the amount of detail. If you really are interested in economic history, you have to have, at least as part of your library, even if you don't read them today, the 3 volumes of Capitalism and Civilization. That's the name of the 3 volumes. They are very fat, but believe me, it's clear analytical style, an incredible amount of data that completely overflows the schemes of particularly Marxism. In other words, you don't find the stages of feudalism, then capitalism, then socialism, and any kind of periodization of history at that level. You find the full complexity. He traces the flows of salt. You know, the salt was monopolized in the 14th century by the Hanseatic League at Leipzig, I believe was the city, but I'm not totally sure about that. And he traces how salt would flow throughout Europe through different merchants and merchant firms. He traces how cinnamon would flow through Europe. He traces every single commodity. He gives you maps as to where and how that commodity was produced, how far it reached. He traces what happened to the silver that the Europeans stole from America, from Mexico and Peru. Where did that silver end up? He does a fantastic job of giving you maps for commodity by commodity, right? And of course, that means that he bothered to go to each one of the cities and go to each one of those libraries containing the bank books from Florentine banks in the 14th century and actually went through the bank books, what he calls the dust of history, right? The little details that no other historian would bother to even check. He and his team checked every little detail. So it is the kind of work that you can trust, but also the kind of work that leaves you feeling, boy, we don't have a conceptual framework to think this. This is too heterogeneous, too varied, too complex. So, if we're going to have to choose between Deleuze and Guattari, who were Marxists until the end of their lives and were committed to defend Marx until the end of his life, or Fernand Braudel, who is a leftist, but not a Marxist, and who has done 1,000 times more work on historical detail, I say I would trust Fernand Braudel. If Fernand Braudel says this network of cities was the birth of capitalism, I trust him completely. And there's a very good reason for it. Foreign trade, international trade, generated profits that were 10 to 100 times as large as regular trade, precisely because they were connecting markets and producers and consumers that were not in touch with one another, and therefore they could invent their own prices. Throughout history, each one of these nodes became dominant at a time. Venice was dominant in the 14th century, the dominant node. Then it loses the lead to Genoa in the 15th, because Genoa was like the Dubai of today. Just like Dubai is a center of financiers that basically is there to process petrodollars. There's such an enormous wealth associated with oil that you need a city that's specialized in processing wealth. Genoa in the 15th century was the processor of wealth for entire Europe. All the silver that came from mines in Guanajuato and in Lima, Peru, would arrive at Genoa before actually reaching Madrid, which is obviously its destination. It belonged to the kings of Spain. But because the ships would take 6 months to go to Mexico and 6 months to come back, roughly, what that meant is that the kings would have lots of money suddenly when the ship arrived filled with silver, and if they didn't know how to spend it wisely, then they would have to wait until the next shipment of silver arrived. The arrangement they had then, Madrid, which is located somewhere around there, let's make it into a triangle to show that it is a hierarchical, central place hierarchy. The financiers from Genoa would lend money constantly throughout the year to the kings of Spain, and the kings of Spain would simply pay them with the silver that arrived from the New World. So the shipments of silver from the New World, which of course arrived through the Atlantic, would not stop in Barcelona or other Spanish ports, go directly to Genoa. So as Braudel says, who do you think profit the most from the silver stolen from the New World? The Spanish? No, the Genoese. Lisbon was another capital. Well, let me just continue, because actually Lisbon was never. Antwerp, which became an incredibly potent trading center, was now the capital by the 16th, not the capital, the dominant node by the 16th century. That means that the center of gravity of Europe had already started moving in the 16th century to the north. Yes?
There was no silver from the New World in the 15th century, right?
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right, because it's 1492. This is the 16th century. And this is the first half. You're absolutely right. Thank you for telling me that. And it's the second half. It was the end of the 15th century, but obviously you cannot get any silver if you discover America in 1492. Amsterdam becomes the capital in the 17th century. London, not the capital, the dominant node of the network. The 18th and 19th centuries. And eventually New York, I'm going to add it here even though it's not in the map, continues to be the capital of this network, which still exists in the 20th century. So, we're gonna have to take a break soon, but let me just finish up what I just said. These cities then were oriented towards the outside. Unlike landlocked capitals which turn to look inwards and who try to distill their identity from local cultural producers to define a very well-defined regional identity in contrast with rival regions around them, these guys never cared about defining an identity. First of all, they couldn't have anyway. Their neighborhoods were inhabited by different ethnicities, precisely because they were long-distant merchant towns. Armenians, Jews, Muslims, Dutch in Venice, Venetians in Amsterdam would form neighborhoods of merchants within those cities. Venice, for instance, the word ghetto is actually of Venetian origin, Venetian Italian. It didn't mean what it means today, but it meant a neighborhood that the government of Venice had decreed was for Armenian traders, or was for Jewish traders, or was for Muslim traders, or was for Dutch traders, right? They wanted to put it in one place. But despite the fact that they were segregated in different neighborhoods, and a similar story can be told of the other cities, they commingled. So if you were somebody who lived in Venice in the 14th century, or somebody who, like Spinoza, who lived in Amsterdam in the 17th, you would walk around the streets and you would see people with turbans, people with tunics. You would hear all kinds of different tongues and languages spoken. You would get used to a cosmopolitan view of the world. You were not provincial in the metaphorical sense of the word. Living your own regional culture and being proud of your own regional culture and being, dismissive of the regional cultures elsewhere, which you saw as inferior, even within your own country or within your own province.
Like Saas-Fee?
Excuse me?
Like Saas-Fee?
So here they were used to heterogeneity. So they never tried to distill a Venetian culture or a Genoese culture. Right? London, I have to say, is an exception, because London is a schizophrenic city. It's half maritime port, connected to the rest of the world financially to this day, and it is the capital of the country. But as you can see when you go to London, the two halves of the city are actually literally two different halves. It's Westminster City, with the tradition and the Queen and the guards and the changing of the guards and all the trappings of the aristocracy and the court. And then there's the city of London proper, which is the financial center, which has absolutely nothing to do with those things, right? These are like can-do financiers thinking about numbers and thinking about large amounts of capital, investments and so on at an international level. They couldn't care less about the Queen and the changing of the guard and so on. So London is weird that way. But nevertheless, you can still see that half of London belonged to this network. while the other half of London may have actually been more part of England proper, with it, English pride agriculture and so on. So culturally, they were very different. They were hybrids in all respects. Commercially, they were very different because they traded only luxury items, from spices to porcelains to silks to precious metals. And of course, transportation was 10 times as fast, because transportation by sea was so much faster, with the exception of the Pony Express that I just mentioned, which was only of use by very few people. Transportation by sea was 10 times as fast as by land, which means that Venice was closer to Genoa, or even closer to Lisbon in terms of traveling time, not in terms of distance, than it was from, say, Florence, the capital of Tuscany, or Rome, in its own backyard or in its own territory. Right? It would take you longer to get from Venice to those cities than it would take you to get from Venice to Lisbon. Now that meant that these cities were closer connected to one another than they were with cities of their own language. Okay, I'm going to continue. Okay guys, this is the plan. We have an hour left for today. Tomorrow we need to switch to other subjects. So I want to finish with some thoughts about economics. And I mentioned it before, the point where I break with Deleuze and Guattari, their espousal of Marxism, and the options that we have to build a new political economy for the left. A progressive political economy, just like what Marxism was supposed to do. But if Marxism turned out to be wrong, and with all the new data that we have, what options would we have for the future? So I want to analyze in the rest of the hour the concept of capitalism, to see what's worthwhile keeping, what's worthwhile throwing away, what we need to invent that's new, what new piece of historical data we need to add, and so on and so forth. I'm going to take some questions right now, but I just want to say, just to finish this idea, this network of cities, the first one to map them was Fernand Braudel. I'm going to write down his name too, because of all the names that I've written down on the blackboard, the most important is Fernand Braudel. Today, if you're going to read only one author of all the different authors that I've been giving you today, don't read me. Read Fernand Braudel. He beats the crap out of me anytime, right? I'm like nothing compared to this guy. Capitalism and Civilization. As the name is, a 3-volume thing. Don't get scared by the size of the thing. Buy them, particularly if you see them at half price in one of those Amazon, used book sellers and so on. Keep them in your library for when you do have time. And kind of leaf through it, just to see how rich economic history can be, how exciting economic history can be, and how important it is to get the history of the past if we ever want to create a better future. Right? So this network of cities, particularly once we get to the 17th century with Amsterdam, in which Amsterdam was not only connected to European cities, but was connected to New York, was connected to the Philippines, and was connected to Indonesia, and was connected to China, was connected to Japan, was connected to India. Amsterdam in the 17th century was already a global city. Globalization, which we tend to think of as a modern phenomenon, began in the 17th century. Of course, it was globalization of commerce, not globalization of finance, and much less so globalization of industry. But nevertheless, globalization was already a reality in terms of commerce by the 17th century, that's in the 1600s. And you can tell that the kinds of cities that participated in that were cities that were in a way deterritorialized. That is, that were not tied to their territory like landlocked capitals. The best way to tell when a city is entirely deterritorialized is if there is a war covering the entire territory and affecting its neighboring cities, and yet that city is selling weapons to both sides of the war. I mean, that's the symptom, that that city doesn't really give a damn about any territorial linkages, any territorial ties, any historical ties to its own territory. Well, that was Amsterdam in the 17th century. 17th century witnesses one of the first world wars. It was not really a world war, but everybody in Europe was involved. It's called the 30 Years' War. It was from 1618 to 1648. And throughout the war, Amsterdam is selling, the two sides were, on one hand, what's called the Habsburg Empire, Spain, Austria, Hungary. They have become one empire through marriage networks. France wanted to, of course, it was a Catholic empire, of course. France was also Catholic, but it feared the power of the Habsburg Empire, so it allied with Protestant countries, with Sweden in particular, which was a big military power in the 17th century, against the Habsburg Empire. And they fought one of the most horrible wars in terms of casualties that Europe has ever seen. In fact, in terms of casualties as a ratio of the population, it is as lethal as World War I, which is the most lethal war that we remember from the last century. So exhausted was everybody after 30 years of warfare that in 1648 they signed a treaty, a peace treaty in a region of Germany called Westphalia. Today we remember that the Treaty of Westphalia, which is the first legal document in which countries, that is France, Spain, and so on, appeared as legal agents. In other words, it is considered, the Peace Treaty of Westphalia is considered the beginning of international law. Prior to the Treaty of Westphalia, there was no international law. And it is the first document, the first legal document in which the concept of sovereignty appears as a legal concept. The concept had been coined about 30 years earlier by Baudin, but as a theoretical concept by a legal scholar, not as a necessity to end a war and to end the carnage. Sovereignty, as everybody knows, means basically that a country or a government can do anything within its borders, including killing or harassing its minorities, which has been done by countries for the longest time. Today, of course, international law has changed because we have the UN after World War II, and today sovereignty doesn't mean that anymore. Otherwise, we would not be bombing Libya today. Otherwise, we would not have invaded Iraq. Otherwise, we would not have invaded Afghanistan. But Libya is perhaps a better example because Libya is a war that's being fought supposedly for humanitarian reasons and with a UN permission. Well, that was illegal in the 17th century. Right? Sovereignty became a concept. International law became a reality. International lawyers became a profession. And while everybody else was exhausting itself, fighting each other, gaining territory, losing it again, Amsterdam was deterritorialized, floating above the rest, connected to the rest of the world via commercial routes, making lots and lots and lots of money. When it was the turn of London to become the center of the node, the British or the English, I can't remember if the British Empire had already been put together, but let's call them the English, invent the first Federal Reserve Bank. It wasn't called the Federal Reserve Bank, it was called the Bank of England. But it's the first central bank that's supposed to control inflation, that's supposed to deal with an external debt, and it's supposed to borrow from other countries and service the debt via earmarked taxes. So they invented that in order to be able to tap into all the wealth that had accumulated in Amsterdam. So the English kind of rose into prominence by first borrowing like crazy from the Dutch, who had accumulated all that money precisely by not getting involved in anything terrestrial, by not getting involved in anything that involved a territory, not defending territories, and being exclusively a city of the sea. Now, Deleuze and Guattari play a great emphasis on that. They do believe that, in the deterritorializing power of the sea. They realize that all of the cities were much more deterritorialized. Remember what we mean by that is the knob in the assemblage that tells you how well-defined the identity is or how fuzzily defined the identity is. Landlocked capitals are much more territorialized. I call this gateways, maritime gateways, because they were gateways to the outside. They were gateways to foreign cultures. They were gateways, many of the inventions that eventually made Europe win the colonial competition in the millennium, the compass, gunpowder, the printing press, which were invented in China, entered Europe through Venice. The double entry bookkeeping, the debt in paper like checks and things like that, which were Islamic in origin, entered Europe through Venice. So that's what I mean by a gateway city. It's pointing towards other countries, to other areas of the world, many of which were more advanced, because remember that up to 1500, China and the different Islamic empires and kingdoms that existed were technologically and militarily superior than Europe. For instance, just to give you an example, one of the great triumphs of the Europeans was when the Portuguese, after spending the entire 1400s mapping the sea, had finally managed to go all around Africa and get to the Indian Ocean, and to break the monopoly that Venice and Genoa had of trade with Islam, trade with the Levant. Right? Now the Portuguese had found a route, much longer clearly, but nevertheless they didn't have to fight wars against the Venetian or the Genoese. And so in the late 1400s, 1470s, Vasco da Gama arrives at the Indian Ocean and begins, of course, doing what Europeans ever did, colonizing the place, buying cheap stuff and selling things very expensive, and so on and so forth. But, unknown to the Europeans, the Chinese, under a commander named Cheng Ho, had been sending ships to the Indian Ocean from 1415 to 1450. The ships were 5 times as large as the flagship that Vasco da Gama brought to the Indian Ocean. 5 times as large, with 5 times as many guns, cannon, 5 times as many sailors, with as much seaworthiness in terms of the construction of the ship, and seamanship in terms of the skills of the sailors as the Portuguese ever had. And those travels were suspended in a completely contingent way by the Chinese government when there was an invasion by Mongols, which of course don't come from the sea, but came from Central Asia. China's capital was one of these maritime gateways at the time, Nanking, and they had to change their capital to be closer to the terrestrial frontier, to Peking. And the moment they change their capital to Peking, they become landlocked. They forget about the adventures of Chen Ho. Chen Ho is eliminated, and they stop sending ships to the Indian Ocean. Now, think what would have happened, and this is how contingent history is, had the Mongols taken another 50 years to invade. After all, the Mongols and the nomads of the steppes in general, the Huns, the Hittites, the Mongols, and there's like 17 or 18 different ethnic groups, but they were all warrior-like, and they always terrorized both, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Europe, because they always beat the crap out of them. They were the best warriors in the world. And since they had been invading China and the West throughout centuries, it is very easy to think that maybe they would have taken 50 years to do that, right? Now, let's imagine that. So it's 1450, and the Mongols don't attack. So Cheng Ho continues bringing his gigantic sea ships to the Indian Ocean, extracting tribute and doing commerce with different ports on his way there. Vasco da Gama would have sailed right into it, would have all of a sudden found a ship that's 5 times as large. They would have bombed them or, cannon them or shoot them out of the water, because they had no chance whatsoever militarily against the Chinese. And the Chinese would have understood that there's a new route to Europe. There's another continent that we don't know about. All we have to do is round Africa, the reverse route of the Portuguese. And the Chinese, at that time, we're talking about 1460, 1470, would have discovered Europe, in the same sense that Christopher Columbus discovered America, right? And we would all be speaking Chinese today, because the Chinese would have been unstoppable. They were better at everything at that time. So the way Fernand Braudel puts it, this was a missed opportunity. A missed opportunity to become the leaders of the millennium. They had been. Many historians now talk of the years 1000 to 1500 as the era of Chinese predominance. And that era would have continued had Chen Ho's expedition continued. Instead, they suspended the expeditions and they opened a window of opportunity for Europe. And Europe took the opportunity. By the 1840s, they were already fighting opium wars against China and subjugating China for almost 100 years. History could have been entirely different had one contingent little detail been changed. So, moving on. I want to now, since this sets the stage for my discussion of capitalism, right? Now let me just show you, again, before leaving this map. I'm going to put with red the areas of Europe. This is basically France and Spain. And large parts of that were feudal. It doesn't mean they didn't have large cities like Paris and so on, but there were many manors with agricultural economies very backward, trading among themselves in a very close type of society. Feudalism was real, it just wasn't an age. With blue, I'm going to mark those areas that already by 1300 were non-feudal. In fact, in many senses, they were modern. These areas include, of course, Flanders, which is today's Belgium. I kind of ran out of blue color. Let's see if I can put it green. Flanders, or today's Belgium, highly urbanized, highly modern already by the 14th and 15th centuries. The areas that eventually became Holland, at the time they called the United Provinces. Northern Italy, including not only Venice and Genoa, but also Milan, Florence. And of course, northern Germany, including, most importantly, the Hanseatic League cities, and I'm also including Lisbon here. But England had large portions of land that were feudal in the exact same way in which Marx called feudalism. Spain, France. So larger territorial states, countries, crystallized in Europe first in those areas. Why? Because they did not have the competition from city-states. City-states fought against statehood. City-states fought against being absorbed into a larger territorial, with a consequence that Germany, Italy, Belgium, Holland did not acquire a unified language and unified schooling system, a unified countrywide system of institutions, and until the 19th century. Larger territorial states found those cities, both landlocked capitals and maritime metropolises, an obstacle to the crystallization. So feudal areas did exist. It's just that the era was not called feudalism. There was never an era in which the entire Europe was feudal. So for the same reason, it was not as if there first came feudalism and then there came another era called capitalism, right, which was supposed to be superseded later on by yet another era called socialism. That periodization of history is false. It never had any basis on reality. Now, we cannot blame poor Karl Marx for it. The available historical evidence when he wrote, in the 1860s and 70s, was, we know now, retrospectively, was very poor. Max Weber, who wrote only 30 or 40 years later, had already available to him twice as much historical data. So Marx did the best he could with the historical data that he had. Nevertheless, he made several mistakes, and we're going to need to discuss them. The first point that I want to make is this. Going back to Fernand Braudel. As I said, Capitalism and Civilization is his masterpiece. He wrote, after that, a book on France, also several volumes, which is probably mostly of interest to French historians. So his very last grand work was Civilization and Capitalism. It's 3 volumes. So you would think, knowing that it's his magnum opus, he would want to end the last chapter of the 3rd volume, the last paragraph of the last chapter of the 3rd volume with a bang. Right? I unfortunately did not bring it to read it to you, but I've read it to my students so many times that I know it verbatim. That very last paragraph says this. If we make an unequivocal distinction between the market economy and capitalism, the first time I read that, I'm going like, Fernand, you've gone nuts. We need to, get a straitjacket for you here, man, because the market economy and capitalism are the same thing. They're synonyms. And he's asking us to make an unequivocal distinction between the market economy and capitalism. He says, if we make an unequivocal distinction between the market economy and capitalism, could we, for the first time, break away from those choices that politicians put to us, either monopolies and oligopolies governing everything with supposedly as part of a free market, or the state owning anything and planning everything in 5-year plans? Would it be possible that if we understand that history shows that there was never a capitalist system, that there was always a coexistence of at least 2 different types of economic systems, which he calls capitalism and the market economy? Would it be possible that in the future we'll make better choices and we'll be able to make a better society? And that's the way that book ends, with that statement. We must make an unequivocal distinction between the market economy and capitalism. And what does he mean? Well, he means that he basically has changed the meaning of the word capitalism from a mode of production, which was the meaning in Marx, and a mode of industrial production, to big business, to put it in the simplest possible way. What he's saying, and what he says in those 3 volumes is, wholesalers never operated by the same rules as retailers. Wholesalers were big, retailers were small. And scale, economies of scale, matter. Large factories operating on economies of scale and doing mass production were never the same as small factories, not necessarily working on crafts, but working on perhaps advanced products, but at a smaller scale and utilizing skills rather than routines. And he says small money lenders were never the same as the large financiers, like the Fugers, who lent so much money to so many kings and they were bankrupt when the kings went bankrupt. He notices a phenomenon that we have noticed in our own era. When in 2008 the economy went down the tubes, and Lehman Brothers disappeared, and a bunch of other banks were on the brink of disappearing. I mean, we're still living the consequences of that, because the reason why they don't want to restructure the debt for Greece is because they are afraid of what's going to happen to those banks. The phrase, certain institutions are too big to fail, began to make the rounds. Right? What does that mean, too big to fail? Well, they are so huge that if they fall down, everything else falls down. And what Braudel is trying to tell us is that that phrase characterizes the entire millennium for certain sectors of the economy. There has always been financiers or industrialists or wholesalers or international traders that were too big to fail, and their governments had to bail them out. Now, when you bail people out like that, like the United States government bailed out its banks and bailed out General Motors, what you do is this. You allow profits to be privatized, whereas losses become socialized. In other words, whatever earnings you are going to make, you can keep them. But all those losses that you have, taxpayers are going to pay for them. Now, are you going to tell me that that is the market economy? Are you going to tell me that that has anything to do with demand and supply setting the prices for things in an anonymous way? It has nothing to do with that. Brodel, to make the point, coined the phrase anti-markets to refer to any firms that were too big to fail and privatized profits socialize losses. What he's telling us is this is not a new phenomenon. It is a new phenomenon in its scale, certainly, but not a new phenomenon at all. So, I tried to use that word in one of my books, 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History. It didn't stick, so I'm not going to try to sell it anymore. But I'm putting it here on the board because it is very clear what he's trying to say. These firms do not belong to the market. In other words, they are not subject to market forces. They manipulate demand and supply. And when their manipulations and their speculations fail, there's always a king, there's always an emperor who says, hey, this is a national champion. We can, the French government, we cannot let Renault fail because it's part of our national pride, right? And also because large manufacturers in times of war are the first ones to be converted to producers of weapons. So you need their factories, you need their expertise in the case in wartime. So the French government comes in and saves Renault. It allows it to privatize profits, and it allows it to socialize losses. In other words, it sticks us with the losses. So what Brodel is trying to argue here is this cannot possibly be what Adam Smith was talking about. We need to rethink the idea of an economic system. It is not a monolithic system. It's inhabited by all kinds of heterogeneous entities. I already tried to give you a sense of this when I talked about the difference between Emilia-Romagna and Silicon Valley on one hand and Route 128 in the other. Of course, I did not give you enough detail. I only sent you to the book, Regional Advantage, which you're going to find fascinating because it speaks about our own times. And it's about the computer industry. So it's something that's very relevant to us right now. Right? But nevertheless, this is what Brodel says. Now, let's start finding then holes. In other words, this is the version of economics that I subscribe to. I believe in anti-markets. I used the word anti-markets. I would continue to use it if I found that it made any headway. But I think that the historical evidence is on our side. So, let me then find a few holes, and I'm not going to be able to do a thorough analysis of all the different theories of capitalism, but let's at least review them so that to show you that there are holes in them, and that therefore the option that I'm offering you is a valid, that we need an option. Right? Let's begin with Marx. For Marx, capitalism is defined as a mode of production. Which in turn is defined by a mode of surplus extraction. The different modes of surplus extraction include slavery, serfdom, and wage labor. Capitalism is, of course, defined as a mode of production using as its mode of surplus extraction wage labor. Feudalism is defined as a mode of production using as its mode of surplus extraction serfdom. And the Romans and others in the past that have used slavery, including the United States in recent times, have used as a mode of surplus extraction slavery itself. Now, in the case of slavery and serfdom, it is very easy in what sense we're talking about extraction. You buy slaves, you force them to work long hours, you don't ever give them any of the products of their own labor. Well, you're extracting labor from those slaves. Couldn't be any clearer in that particular case, right? Serfdom is similar, although it's more like a protection racket. The feudal lord, whether it was a prince or other kind of, aristocrat, would exchange protection. Like if they were invaders and so on, the medieval knights would come out and fight the invaders and protect the peasants in exchange for 3, 4, 5 days of forced labor, depending on the area, right? Now that is a way of surplus extraction, because it's almost like when gangsters come in, a liquor store or a dry cleaning store and go, hey, we're here to sell you protection, and the owner of the store goes, protection against who? Protection against us, because if you don't give us that money, we're going to beat the crap out of you. That is what a protection racket is, and feudalism was, to a large extent, a protection racket. So it is a mode of exploitation in which serfdom and slavery are inherently exploitative. But then there comes that third one, wage labor. For Marx, of course, wage labor was inherently exploitative. What does that mean? That there is no such thing as a fair wage. It doesn't matter how much you pay the workers. You are not ever going to compensate them for the labor. Right? You're always going to be exploiting them. It doesn't matter what. Now, we can ask our question, is that true? Where did he get that idea? Well, he got the idea from what is called the labor theory of value. Which was first postulated by Adam Smith, but as an aside, he never developed it. In Adam Smith, it's more like the hypothetical explanation of value, more than a theory, really. But in the hands of Marx, it became a real theory. Marx argued in the following way. Everybody, of course, is familiar with the concept of value added, right? Particularly now that international production, certain parts go first to Singapore, then they go to South Korea, then they get assembled in Japan, and then the final touches are put in Apple Computer in Cupertino, California, right? So that at every step of the production line, workers add value. So what Marx said is, only workers produce value. Machines don't produce value. The organization of production doesn't produce value. The savings that an entrepreneur may have brought to start a factory, to start a business, don't produce value. Only workers produce value. Now, if that was true, then that means that every cent of profits that a factory makes belongs to the workers, because they produce all the value. Nothing else produces value. And because they never get all the profits, never, right? That chunk of the profits that the owner of the factory keeps, that is what is being extracted from the workers. And notice what consequences this had. Because machines don't produce value, and that is, of course, the very first thing that I would question. I mean, nobody's going to tell me that a steam engine, we talked about it yesterday, operating on the basis of intensive differences of temperature, and then using differences in vapor transforming into water transforming into vapor to move the pistons up and down, and actually, hammering leather and hammering textiles and doing a variety of machine-like labor things. I would claim that produces value, but wait a minute until I get to that. Marx didn't believe that. For Marx, a steam engine was simply the coagulated labor of the workers that put it together. In other words, the design of the steam engine didn't matter. The science behind the steam engine, thermodynamics, didn't matter. Knowledge and design don't produce value for Marx. Now, what consequence does this have? Well, something that he calls the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. I'm going to explain. This was a law for him, the law of capitalism. In fact, it was the main contradiction of capitalism. What was going to be, the Hegelian contradiction that was going to bring capitalism down inevitably as a matter of dialectical necessity. What does it mean? We just separate them so I do not get confused. The tendency of the rate of profit to fall goes like this. Only premise number one, only workers produce value. Machines don't produce value, capital doesn't produce value, organization of production doesn't produce value. I disagree with all three, but let's forget about it for a second. Well, if only workers produce value, and if the bourgeoisie, wants to replace workers with machines, as they do want to, because workers strike, whereas machines don't strike, that tendency of bourgeois owners to mechanize production means that they were going to be slowly but surely replacing humans with machines. And because machines don't produce value, only workers produce it, the profits are going to start declining. I mean, it makes perfect sense, right? If only workers produce value, if machines don't produce a single bit of value, and every single bit of profit belongs to the workers, then as you replace workers with machines, there's going to be less and less profits. In the end, automated factories are not going to make any money at all. And when we arrive at that point, said Marx, capitalism will destroy itself. Of course, if this was true, it makes perfect sense, right? If capitalist factories are going to produce less and less profits, and they are actually approaching a point where they're not going to produce any profits whatsoever, well, at that point, socialism is inevitable. Because now you are negating the very productivity of the means of production. You're not even producing anything. The question now is, the argument makes perfect sense. Now the question is about evidence. A posteriori. The argument makes perfect sense a priori. Now, a posteriori. Can anyone point to a single a robot's factory, like those robotic factories in Japan where everything is done by robots, the soldering, the painting of the car, and so on, that doesn't produce any value? Can anyone point to a single case in history? No. Machines produce value. That's why those robotic factories are highly profitable. Organization of production produces value. And the savings that an entrepreneur brings to starting a factory also produce value. That's why an entrepreneur, as opposed to an executive or a manager, is risking his or her own money in order to produce a vision. So this is false. But because this is false, and because it is the main contradiction that was going to bring capitalism down inevitably, well, then it turns out that there is not a single contradiction that's going to build the capitalist system down inevitably. Now, do Deleuze and Guattari understand this? No, they don't. They, in fact, praise this law as they define capitalism differently. I'm gonna give you the definition in a second. But they say they define capitalism as an axiomatic of the territorialized and decoded flows. That's their definition of capitalism. So, and they say in a passage, which I will try to find in a second, if anything proves the nature of capitalism as an axiomatic of decoded flows, is the law for the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. In other words, they are hooked in Marxism to the point where they cannot even question something that to everybody should be obvious is false. Entirely false. Now, I personally, I was a Marxist when I was a kid. I wore a Che Guevara t-shirt until I was like 30 or something. In Mexico, as in most of Latin America, there's no such thing as right-wing intellectuals. I mean, there is no such thing as right-wing intellectuals in the United States either, but they at least claim to have, and they have their journals and stuff. But in Latin America, if you're an intellectual, you're a leftist, and if you're a leftist, you're a Marxist, period. So when I arrived in New York in 1975, I came with Das Kapital, and I came with a bunch of, and I was a Marxist, right? But it was when I began to realize that it was full of holes, that I just couldn't honestly continue to follow this thing. because it, to me, logical coherence and compatibility with evidence is the only thing that guarantees that something is, if not infallible knowledge, at least reliable knowledge. And I cannot do with anything else. Let me give you a second hole here before I move to Deleuze and Guattari. Mass production. Mass production, I mean, there are many subjects. Huh? I'm being very selective right now because we have less than half an hour. And I don't want to claim that this is a thorough critique of Marxism, because it is not. I'm simply pointing to a couple of holes. A thorough critique of Marxism would take a volume. And secondly, also as a disclaimer, Marx was a giant in intellectual history. We can find holes in his theories. That doesn't mean that the guy was not a genius, right? Geniuses make mistakes, particularly when they're the ones that take the first stab at something, the first stab at a leftist political economy. That was Marx. You always make mistakes the first time. That's why the whole point is not to close the system so fast so that future generations continue to work it, continue to elaborate it, and continue to perfect it. The authority of Marx, unfortunately, closed most of those doors for the future. But nevertheless, in the history of ideas, Marx will always be a giant, because in the history of ideas, it doesn't matter if you were right or wrong. It only matters whether you were original by your time. The historian of ideas places an intellectual in a century, in its time, in its place, and then goes, given that historical context, how original were those ideas? How adventuresome the thought, or how daring the thought of that thinker had to be to break with the ideas prevalent at the time to be able to come up with that. That's what the history of ideas measures. Originality. And the guy was original, let's face it. And we wish our books had ever the impact that Karl Marx's books had, right? So, having said that, he was wrong about just about everything. Partly because he didn't get his history right, because he didn't have enough historical data. Secondly, he used Hegelian dialectics as his diagram, as his morphogenetic diagram. Remember, materialism, whether it's Marxist or the one that I'm proposing to you, the main category is always production. I said that in my public lecture. You cannot take hydrogen atoms for granted. We need to know how they are produced within stars. We cannot take plants and animals for granted. We need to know how they were produced evolutionarily. Materialism is all about synthesis. And we've been doing that today. Emergent properties are synthesized from the interactions between component parts. So synthesis, production, are materialist categories par excellence. So I'm not blaming Marx for that. The problem is he took his synthesis from the negation of the negation. That is Hegel. He thought, and he said so, that all that was necessary was to place Hegel upside down, or rather right side up. Hegel was an idealist, thinking that alienation was between the spirit and reality, but in the end that alienation would end. If you place them right side up, then it is the alienation of the workers from the profits they should own, what they have been illegally taken away from them or unjustly taken away from them. But the workers will eventually be disalienated or united with the product of their labor. So that was another one of his mistakes. The third mistake, which is the absence of historical data, it is less of a mistake and more of a condition. I wish he had had access to all this material. So I'm just going to mention one very, very special, very, very important thing having to do with mass production. Mass production is discussed in Das Kapital, in the chapter under collectivization. But and Marxists today, and by Marxists I mean, everybody from, many Deleuzians, like Michael Hart, and what's the name of Tony Negri, in the book Empire. And there are many other Marxist Deleuzians around there. Right? They call mass production Fordism, because they believe that Henry Ford invented mass production. Now, I'm not going to deny that Henry Ford was the first to put together all of the different elements. The assembly line, the conveyor belt, the routinization of labor, the very strict industrial discipline. But did he invent it? Was it a bourgeois person who invented it, or does it have another origin? Well, we know, since the work of Virilio and Michel Foucault, and now this has been documented by many American historians, that mass production was invented 100 years before Ford in military arsenals and armories in France and the United States. Mass production has a military origin, and for a very good reason. Remember that mass production is the production of identical parts, mass-produced identical parts. Now, the first institutional organization that needed identical parts was the military, in the form of spare parts for weapons. Prior to the 18th century, every weapon, every musket, or even early rifles, were manufactured by hand by a different artisan. Today, of course, those weapons are incredibly valuable because they are handmade and they are beautifully made. But as the French and the Germans realized in a war, when you want to send spare parts for weapons to the front, if every weapon is manufactured by a different artisan, you're not going to be able to take component parts of one weapon and fit them into another weapon. They won't fit. Each one is manufactured by a different person. So even if you're following the same model, they won't fit perfectly. So the idea of mass production is the idea of disciplining workers in such a way and establishing a system of production that you're going to end up with identical products at the end within the tolerances of the time, which might be 10 millimeters, 1 millimeter, or so on as the time passes. The inventor of that was an armorer in 18th century France. His name is Honore Blond. And that was my best shot at pronouncing his last name, so don't even try to correct me. Honore Blond. He ran an armory in the 1700s, 1750s, 1760s, 1770s. It was a long time. And he came up with the idea of creating perfect weapons with interchangeable parts. In other words, spare parts. This is a concept that today is entirely familiar, but at the time was not. He at first applied this method to gun carriages, that is to artillery, to the carriages that carry large artillery pieces. Legend goes that in the late part of the 18th century, Thomas Jefferson, who eventually became one of the American founding fathers and so on, was ambassador in Paris and was given a tour of Honore Blond's armory. And of course, what he saw looked incredibly modern to him, right? Workers that are not using craft skills anymore, but following mechanized routines. Everybody doing the same thing over and over and over again in perfect rhythm. A supervisor, which was military supervisor, applying military discipline to each one of those workers so that there would not be a moment wasted. Fixtures, which basically means plaques of metal in which the caliber of the gun, the size of the different parts were cut in so that when a worker finished, for instance, the muzzle of a gun, you could immediately test it whether it was within the tolerances by placing it within the hole. In other words, commands became frozen in steel so that they could be enforced. And Thomas Jefferson was amazed. And I don't blame him, right? This is the first time you saw, a system of production that didn't look like crafts from the past, right? It looked like a system. So Thomas Jefferson brings the idea back to North America when he comes back and passes it to two different people, or two different types of entities. On one hand, he passes it to Eli Whitney an inventor who invented a variety of things, farming, machines and so on, but he began to produce a revolver using the method of an or blanc. But he also passed it to American arsenals and armories. American and armories. Located in Connecticut and Massachusetts. The buildings, by the way, where these armories and arsenals were located are still there in many cases. And then it became a project for the American military. In 1812, there's a war, United States versus England, in which the United States almost loses for lack of spare parts in the front. They just couldn't get enough spare parts to the front. Of course, the United States won that war, but nevertheless Congress, which always reacts after the fact, in a panic, passed a law saying that we must institute an or blanc in all our armories and arsenals. And all of a sudden, 20 different arsenals were produced, mass-producing weapons, and it became known as the American system of manufacturers. Not the French system of manufacturers, but the American system. Why? Because it is the first, it was not just one armor in the United States. In the United States, it became a system. Those same armories and arsenals then began to propagate the method to the civilian industry via the contract system. So they would, for instance, there was a famous manufacturer of axes, which I don't remember the name right now of the company, who began contracting with the military, not for axes, but for other utensils made out of metal. And what the military engineers would do would be first to bring the executives from that firm, give them a show of the arsenal and armory. This is how we do things here. These are the tolerances that you have to meet. And this is the system that you have to follow, else you don't get the contract. So that factory adopted the contract. Another adopted the contract, another adopted the contract. By the time Henry Ford got it, it was 100 years in which the American system of manufacturers, minus the conveyor belt, had been in existence. So how can anybody, unless you're blind to history, call that Fordism? Well, Marxists do. Right? That's what they do. And what we need to do here is fight them, fight back. Why do we have to be accepting these things if we have all the data that says that it is not true? And most importantly, tracing the genealogy of mass production to the military, where it was actually born, gives us an idea of what we have to get rid of. That's why mass production is oppressive, because of the military discipline and the de-skilling of workers that it implies. It's not so much that all the profits are being produced by the workers. That's a lie. It is that the workers are being de-skilled. Remember what we said yesterday about know-how. Know-how is transmitted through example and perfected by doing, by